Tonight's speaker is Jeff Antonelis-Lapp. He is formerly a teacher at Evergreen State College, and this talk, which comes from a book, stems from a want and a need to teach about the natural history of Mount Rainier as part of a class for Evergreen State University, or Evergreen State College, which I always think is a great beginning. It's a great beginning story that comes from that kind of a need, and I'm grateful that he's written it. It was something that didn't exist in the world prior to his writing it. I'm glad that he did. I think it's a fascinating frame for understanding the ecological and human history of our region. Mount Rainier is just such an iconic figure for all of us in this region of the world. And there are a lot of interesting stories to be told about it, not just in recent history, but way back into the past. So without further ado, Jeff Antonelis-Lapp, feel free to take it over.
All right. Fantastic. Hello, everybody. Good evening. So wonderful to be with you. Really happy to be with you. I am Jeff Antonelis-Lapp. And I want to thank Cy for reaching out and making the connection and setting this up. And also Matthew, thank you for your work behind the scenes, and particularly for your very heartfelt opening in the recognition of the ground on which you stand right now. And following in your footsteps, I would say to you, welcome. I am in Enumclaw, Washington right now, and that would make that the usual and accustomed land of the people that have come to be known as the Muckleshoot Indian tribe. And Muckleshoot is actually an amalgam of tribes, not too unlike the Yakima Confederation. And Muckleshoot was a name that was given to the first people based on the location of their reservation. But to acknowledge that in my many years of work in Indian country with Muckleshoot and with other tribes, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a few minutes. So let's dig in, let's get started, all right? I've got lots of images to share with you folks tonight. I'm going to take you on a couple of virtual field trips, so I hope you've got your walking shoes on. Maybe you've got a day pack with some snacks and a water bottle. We're going to check out some cool things at Mount Rainier. So let's gear up. All right. So as I said, I'm going to be talking with you and telling you stories tonight from my natural history of Mount Rainier National Park. That's called Tahoma and Its People. It was published last March by Washington State University Press. Go Cougs. And you might know that Tahoma is one of several Native American names for Mount Rainier. And if you'd like me to talk a little bit more about that, I know a bit more, you could ask that as a question afterwards, and we'll get to it when we do the question and answer session, all right? And as I get rolling, in this talk, I really need to acknowledge two groups of people that have been so important to me, my life, my development as a scholar, in the research for the book. And actually the first group, this started many years before I even started to work on Tahoma. I was invited onto Indian reservations in Western Washington, particularly at Muckleshoot, and also at Nisqually, also at Quinault out on the coast. And I was there primarily to teach. I was hired to teach on these reservations. I have to tell you the truth, I really learned more from the folks there than I really ever taught, probably. And because of their kindness and their openness to having me be among them, I was able to study Hullshootseed. Now, Hullshootseed is the southern dialect of the Lushootseed language. Hullshootseed was spoken on these grounds, right where I am tonight. And so I could start by saying, "Eh, chof, siyaya. Eh, chof, siyaya. Hello, friend. Hello, friend." And so in addition to that, folks kind of took me under their wing, and they took me out into the forest near here taught me how to harvest red cedar bark. They probably saw I was an easy mark for, some good free labor and that I had a good strong back. It's really hard work. Harvesting Western red cedar bark is really hard work, and learn to process it and even to weave with it a bit. And those are some of the things that enabled me to learn about and to tell the stories about their ancestors that have gone to Tahoma, Mount Rainier, for generations, for thousands of years. The other group of folks that's been super helpful are people in the National Park Service, particularly the scientists and other staff at Mount Rainier National Park, who were just so helpful to me throughout my 10 years of research. For example, Rebecca and Scott, a couple of aquatics biologists, they took me into alpine lakes. Some of these lakes don't even have names. They have numbers. Some lakes don't even have established trails to get into them, but nonetheless, they drug me into these alpine lakes so that I could learn something about alpine ecology and its place in the bigger picture. These, I believe, are Cascade frog tadpoles that I found in a lake last August, Aurora Lake up at Cowiche Park. Also, a couple of the geologists, and Scott and Paul, and I use the word rockhead in the most affectionate way possible, that these are two of my favorite rockheads. And these fellows and others on their crew invited me to come along on lots of work around the mountain, even climbing onto the Nisqually Glacier to help take measurements. And finally, and maybe most importantly, park archaeologist Greg Burchard really took me in and volunteered to help me learn about the archaeological record at Mount Rainier. He invited me to volunteer at 3 digs. I actually got to work at 3 archaeological digs. This is one at the Ohanapakash campground. Might talk a little bit more about that. So because of all of these interactions, all these people in my life and all the field work, 250 days or so of field work at Mount Rainier to research and write the manuscript, there's a lot of stories. There's a lot of stories. And I think if you read Tahoma, there will be a number of them that really work for you. But I think for tonight's talk, our best bet is to narrow it down to what I like to call Tahoma's biggest stories. And so I'm going to really focus in on 2 big ideas, okay? First is that people have been going to Mount Rainier for a long time, for over 9,000 years. And believe it or not, this is relatively new information. We really didn't know any of this 60 or 70 years ago. And the second big idea is that the effects of climate change at Mount Rainier are far-reaching. Most people have a nodding acquaintance with the idea that the glaciers are probably retreating or are mostly retreating at Mount Rainier. And that's true. And there also are some far-reaching other effects that I'd like to talk with you about too. As I said, lots of pictures. I'm going to throw a couple of pop quizzes in along the way, just as a way to help you kind of land on what I think are maybe some of the main ideas. So I hope you have your favorite beverage. I hope we can get started. And let's begin with Lieutenant August Couts. He was an Army lieutenant. He was stationed at Fort Steilacoom in the mid-1800s. Steilacoom is about 60 miles. The fort was about 60 miles away from the mountain. And like many of us on this call tonight, he became infatuated with it. He became mesmerized by Mount Rainier. He became obsessed with climbing it. And it's what he talked about, and it drove people crazy. And one of the things that's interesting in doing the research of some of these early European American settlers in the area and some of the explorers is that they held this belief that Native people had always avoided the high country. And this is reflected in one of Couts's journal entries where he wrote that information relating to the mountain was exceedingly meager. No white man had ever been near it, and Indians were superstitious and afraid of it. And ironically, Couts was helped to a large extent by Native people. He had become friends with the noted Nisqually leader Leschi, who suggested that Couts take a route up the Nisqually Valley in attempting his summit attempt in 1857. And Leschi was probably the person who also said, hey, you ought to hire a guide. You ought to hire a Wapaweddy. And Wapaweddy hailed from the same village as Leschi and probably knew the terrain very well. So another example of this idea of this mistaken belief of European Americans about Native people avoiding the high country comes from Hazard Stevens. And Stevens, with his climbing partner, P.B. Van Trump, is generally regarded by most all historians as the first successful ascent of Mount Rainier. And Stevens was under the same ideas, mistaken ideas, as Couts, and he had written of Mount Rainier that it was a virgin peak and that the superstitious fears and traditions of the Indians had prevented their attempting to reach the summit. So again, fears and traditions of the Indians. And I should mention here that you have already heard me using the term Indian interchangeably with Native American, First People, Indigenous, and in some regions of the country that might grate against people in some way, but because around here, actually that's part of the official name, the Muckleshoot Indian tribe, for example, the Puyallup tribe of Indians. And having worked with Native people, I know that that's a term that they use to describe themselves. So you'll hear me use that, quite a bit throughout the talk. Anyway, Stevens also, crazily enough, was helped by a Native person named Sluiskin, who not only guided them on their trip, but at one point, he basically saved their bacon. And at one point, Sluiskin shot and roasted 4 marmots that they ate as one of their meals. And after Van Trump took a nasty fall on the descent, it was Sluiskin's guiding through the difficult terrain that really got them back to safety. Sluiskin did not summit with them. He had waited back in camp, but he was very important in their getting back to safety. So this idea that Native people had avoided the high country, this persisted for decades and decades until the middle of the 20th century. When in 1963, an anthropology professor from Washington State University, Alan Smith, arranged to interview tribal elders at Yakima on the reservation, at Muckleshoot, and at Nisqually. And in his conversations with these folks, he was able to bring forward a whole body of information that up until that time was not widely known. So the elders told him, for example, that they and their ancestors had been going up into the mountains for generations, for as long as anybody could remember. And one of the reasons they went into the high country was for mountain goats. And of course, their warm wool, their thick hides, made mountain goats highly prized among Native people. And as a quick side trip, I should just mention that mountain goats at Mount Rainier are still relatively easy to see. I think I see them several times every summer, particularly on the north side of the mountain in the Sunrise area. Here's a shot from last summer. This is on the way out to Berkeley Park, so from Sunrise. And you'll notice that these goats apparently got the memo. They're practicing some social distancing there pretty nicely. And on that same day, I was able to find some tracks. This is what a mountain goat tracks look like. And I don't think any natural history talk amounts to anything if you don't have a photograph of some scat, right? So this is also some mountain goat droppings. But anyway, in addition to mountain goats, people also went into the mountains for hoary marmot, which not by all people, all Native people were hunted, but by some groups they were. And people also went to the mountains to gather plants for a whole variety of reasons, primarily a medicinal, technological. In this case, this is bear grass. You know this, it's a member of the lily family. And those slender, long basal leaves at the bottom of the plant there, those were collected and prepared by people and used as imbrication. On this side of the mountain, you'll see some of the basket making has these nice designs in a light color. Oftentimes that will have been made by bear grass. And one of the things that the elders told Smith was that they really went to the mountains for every year was huckleberries. Yeah, huckleberries. Now, it doesn't matter, we could argue that they're mountain blueberries or they're huckleberries, but the point is that several species of vaccinium were highly regarded and highly sought after by Native people. So they would head into the mountains when the snows had receded mid to late summer and pick huckleberries, which of course they ate fresh, but they also preserved them. They also would dry them, maybe build a low intensity fire, put a rack up above the fire, lay a mat down, maybe a cattail mat, throw the berries on that and let them dry in the low heat. And then when they went back to their lowland village, they would, of course, take the berries with them and use them over the winter. They would rehydrate the berries. And it turns out, we know now that, huckleberries are a great source of vitamin C and were really an important part, probably in that way, in native diets. So Smith learned a few other things from the elders. He learned, for example, that the various groups divided up the mountain in certain ways. And so if you see that little white oval, I'm trying to show you where the approximate summit of the mountain is, okay? And then can you see the glaciers that kind of spread away from that, sort of like octopus tentacles? Can you see that? Well, the elders told Smith that they divided the mountain up roughly between the native groups, more or less along ridge lines, as demonstrated by these heavy dark gray lines here on this map. Now, there's no doubt that other groups used the mountain, but these were the 5 primary groups that came forward in Smith's interviews. The other thing he learned was the distance that people traveled to get to the mountain. So what I've added to this map are the yellow stars to help you see the main population centers in the Puget Trough, represented by these 3 native groups. And if you use the scale at the bottom of the map, you can see that even the villages closest to the mountain were more than 30 miles away. And we have to keep in mind that travel by horseback is a pretty recent invention in this region. We've only had horses and travel by horses for a little over 300 years. So what this tells us is people traveled on foot to get to the mountain. And hold on a second, the Yakima villages are over 80 miles away from Mount Rainier. So this tells us that there was a really strong pull to get to Mount Rainier. And why did people come? Principally, it was to access these resources that I'm talking with you about. Now, I want to say a little bit more about the Yakima villages that I don't usually get to talk about, but I'm so excited tonight that 2 friends of mine are here on this talk. My old college buddy, Phil Hoagie. Hi, Phil, glad that you're here. And also my more recently made friend, Ray Palella. And these 2 have been helpful to me. Ray in particular, I met about 8 or 9 years ago. Don't even remember how we made acquaintance, but I became aware that Ray was very well connected and an important part of the development of the William O. Douglas Heritage Trail. And so Ray and I met up at Mount Rainier one summer. I showed him one of the archaeological sites. He and I traced what we think was an old trail from the archaeological site down to the White River. And then we cooked up this crazy idea to cover the old trail, the William O. Douglas Trail, the old trail from Yakima up to Mount Rainier. And over a 4-day Labor Day weekend, we traveled, I think, about 67 or 68 miles on the trail. We started out at William O. Douglas's alma mater, Davis High School. We rode our bikes. Phil was with us that day. I think it was a beautiful day. We rode our bikes. Day 2 was we started getting into the high country, and that's where the bikes were a liability. It was really a hard day's work. And I believe days 3 and 4, we were on foot hiking through the William O. Douglas wilderness. And eventually we came out at Mount Rainier National Park near Ohannabacosh, hiking down the Laughing Water Trail. So we were able to retrace some of that trail that Ray has been so instrumental in locating. And when we get to question and answers, please, direct your questions to those folks, and there may be other experts among us again as well tonight. So we'd like to hear from you too. So back to Smith and his elders, interviews of the elders. When he finished his work, he turned his data over to his colleague, an archaeologist named Richard Doherty at WSU. And that fall of 1963, Doherty set out on foot with a few graduate students, and their idea was to do some ground reconnaissance, see if they could find any archaeological sites based on the interviews. And acting on a tip from a park ranger named Terry Patton, they were able to find a hunter's camp on the northeast side of the mountain. And what they found was this, and if you look in the bottom right-hand quadrant of this rock face, you can kind of see like a concave area, not quite a cave, but like a rock shelter. And what they found there, well, they didn't find me. Okay, what they found there was a backcountry camp. So this was actually later excavated and found to have been a hunter's camp where people, probably from Yakima villages, possibly from Klickitat, maybe from other villages, had come, set up camp here. They built they had a couple of fire hearths, basically camped here so they would have cleaned their game if they'd been successful as hunters, which they were. They would have slept the night here. They would have worked on their tools here. And so this was the first archaeological site found at Mount Rainier National Park. It was kind of a big deal. And so here are some scrapers, some blades, and some projectile points that are representative of some of the kinds of finds at archaeological sites at Mount Rainier. Here's a close-up of a projectile point. And I've got to tell you that this is kind of like the grand prize. Finding something like this is like the gold medal or the Nobel Prize, if you know what I mean. The majority of what we find in the screens and scraping up the dirt and sifting it through screens are tiny little slivers, not much bigger than your pinky fingernail, because the rock in this area was brittle. And so people had to work it a lot. It cracked and broke easily. So probably all the time, people were, reworking tools or making new ones. And wherever they did that, they left behind what we call like a shower of chipstone tool fragments. And these are clues to researchers as to what people were here, what were they doing, and when were they here. So this site, called the Frying Pan Creek Rock Shelter, a big deal in archaeological circles, was also at that time the highest elevation site in the state of Washington, archaeological site. So there's a few other sites that were soon added to the record. And this is our field trip. I want you to come along with me. Check some of these out. These are really, really interesting sites. This one, if you've ever been to the Cowiche Creek picnic area at Mount Rainier National Park, you've been within a few miles of this site. If you have ever hiked up from Cowiche Creek up toward Indian Henry's hunting ground, you've been within a couple hundred yards of this site. And so what we know about this is that it was used for over 7,000 years, probably by ancestors of Nisqually people, because it's in the Nisqually watershed. And so again, people would come here in midsummer after the snows had melted back in pursuit of the kinds of resources that we've been talking about that were unavailable or in short supply near their villages. Now, a couple of things I want to point out to you. This is the expert. This is now retired park archaeologist Greg Burchard, who I've already have mentioned, and he's in the unit actually excavating. And I want you to notice that most of the rest of us, including yours truly, are standing around with our hands on our hips, watching Greg do his work. Greg is really instrumental in the development of the park's record. He added dozens of sites. He really did. He added dozens of sites to the record, and he created models that helped explain where and when did people go on the mountain and when did their behavior and change. And those ideas still guide the trajectory of archaeological work at Mount Rainier. Now, one of Greg's favorite sites is in the northeasternmost part of the park at an unnamed lake. And there's a couple of cool things at this unit that I want you to see. So come with me out to this crazy lake. It's in the Slide Mountain area, northeastern part of the park. First thing is notice these stratigraphic layers. Do you see those different colors? Each of those represent a different volcanic event. So it might have been asphalt or bits bigger than that we would call tephra, so bigger than ash, from Mount Rainier eruption that settled onto the ground, from eruption of Mount St. Helens. Some of these layers are from Mount St. Helens. There's even a layer from Mount Mazama in south central Oregon when it blew its top over 7,000 years ago. And so knowing the age of these layers enables researchers, when they find an artifact in that particular layer, they know almost immediately the approximate age without even having to use radiocarbon dating. It makes it pretty handy. The other thing to see here is this little guy. Here's a close-up. Here's a close-up of this. This is the only one of its kind found at Mount Rainier, and Greg and the other experts believe that this was actually used. This is a piece of stone that has since cracked, as you can see, piece of stone that was used as a cooking griddle. And I think that this whole site is one of Greg's favorites, probably because, well, the volume of material, they recovered over 20,000 stone tool artifacts and site features. The age, some of these things age out at 9,000 years, and with further analysis could be even older. And thirdly, this was a great example of a collaboration with a local tribe. The Muckleshoot Indian tribe contributed resources and logistical support. And so these three things, I think, make this a really special site. Now, for me, one of my favorite sites is in the Sunrise area. This is on the way up to Sunrise. And these were students participating in a summer field school that was operated by Central Washington University. And I think of this site as like kind of like an ancient campground. There are many places here where people came, again, probably from Yakima villages, and also probably came from villages on the White and Green rivers on this side of the mountain, which would make them today Muckleshoot people. So they would have been ancestors of the Muckleshoot people. So folks came up here in family groups. There's so many tools and a wide range of different kinds of tools found here. Experts believe that family groups, so men and women, their children, aunties and uncles, grandparents, extended family, came here again in midsummer, set up camp for anywhere from days to weeks, and went about their business of procuring the resources that they were in search of. Now, here's a couple of students excavating a fire hearth. And these things are like treasure chests. A fire hearth holds so much information potentially for archaeologists. Here's the finished work. The fire pit itself is in the bottom right-hand corner, okay? And of course you would find charcoal, right? And bits of that and fire charred rock. But how about finding bits of bone or teeth or tooth enamel that belong to marmots or belong to mountain goats? Or how about gizzard stones that are later analyzed and found to have belonged to grouse, to sooty grouse? Plant materials like huckleberry seeds, white bark pine nuts, hazelnuts, all those things have been found in these fire hearths. And again, these are clues that help us understand when and where people came to the mountain, sort of things that they did and what they cooked and what they ate. And I like to think of this site, what it would have been like to sit around this campfire a couple thousand years ago, right? Things at this site, as a Sunrise site, had been aged at around 43 or 4,500 years old. So as we finish up this part of the talk, this first big story about people going up to the mountain for millennia, this is a map that shows you some of the over 100 archaeological sites at Mount Rainier. So they might be one of the camps that I've taken you to just now. That might be like a site of an isolated find where people have found like chipstone debris, or someone got lucky and found a projectile point, those sorts of things. And when I look at this map, I often think of the original system of currency that was in play for Native people before European Americans came into the region. And that system of currency was based on a very fine, beautiful marine shell called dentalium. It was harvested by people on the west side of Vancouver Island, and it had great value and great worth to people. And so the shells or the beads were put on strands. It was often called haiqua or aqua. It was put on a strand, and that strand had value, it had worth, and it could be exchanged for goods. And so I think of, as we continue to learn more about the legacy of Native Americans at Mount Rainier, and more information is added to what we know and more sites are added to the record, it's as if we continue to add beads to this strand surrounding Tahoma, like beads on a necklace. So here's a few questions that will help you land on some of the main ideas that we've covered so far. These first couple ones are true and false. So one, European American settlers in Puget Sound country believed that Native Americans went to Mount Rainier frequently. Is that true or false? Answer is false. Number two is that the growing archaeological record at Mount Rainier provides evidence of Native Americans at over 100 locations, stretching back over 9,000 years. True or false? Answer is true. Here's a multiple choice. Number three, most physical evidence of the presence of Native Americans at Mount Rainier is in the form of A, chipped stone debris from tool making and maintenance, B, projectile points, blades and scrapers, C, cedar baskets, or D, fire hearths at ancient camps. Most physical evidence, that's your clue. Answer is A, chipped stone debris from tool making and maintenance. And number four, Native Americans went to Mount Rainier for a variety of reasons. The most common was probably A, for spiritual and religious purposes, B, to gather resources not available near their lowland villages, C, to play bone games and race horses, D, to meet and trade with relatives. And actually there's evidence that people did all of these things at the mountain, but the most common was B, to gather resources not available near their lowland villages. Say, Matthew, could you just double check that everybody is muted? I'm getting a little bit of side chatter. Thank you very much. So let's check and see, how did you do? I would say, 0 to 1 right. I'd say no problem. I hope you're enjoying the talk and just hang in there, keep digging with us. If you were in the 2 to 3 category, you're actually volunteer material, and we're always looking for volunteers at Mount Rainier. And if you got them all right, I would say, well, if we had a Golden Shovel Award, you would probably win it. So let's leave this big idea. We'll return to it when we wrap up the talk in a little bit. But let's get on to our other big story, and that is the effects of climate change at Mount Rainier. Well, I can tell you, when I go out with researchers in the field, that's one of the first things they want to talk about, are what they are seeing as the potential effects of climate change in their field of study. Out at Natchez Peak, working with the butterfly surveyors, chasing butterflies with nets on a nice sunny day, that was one of the first things they wanted to talk about, was the data showing that the numbers of butterflies appear to be changing over time, declining in the subalpine and alpine areas. When I was out with the fisheries biologist, we were tracking bull trout, and in the upper reaches of the White River and some of its tributaries. And what I learned about bull trout is they like really, really, really cold water. And that is probably going to put them at greater risk as waters continue to warm in the coming century. Also at Upper Palisades Lake, we were surveying mostly for long-toed salamanders and these northwestern salamanders here. And again, the aquatics ecologists often talk about what they see coming in terms of warming waters and the impacts that might have on these organisms that especially are highly adapted to really cold mountain streams. And you might know about the work of the University of Washington researchers, go Dogs, and that is up at Paradise, where they're finding that plots of wildflowers are opening earlier in the season and staying open longer than in prior years. And this is all relatively recent. And well, that would be great for visitors. It means the wildflower viewing season is longer, right? But when you consider the intricate patterns of pollination that have evolved over thousands of years, probably, between these wildflowers and the two species of hummingbirds, the bumblebees, the other insects, most of these plants are pollinated by organisms. And so if that gets set off kilter, we're not sure yet what the long-term effects that might have on the plants or their pollinators. So some plants and animals that appear to be in the crosshairs of climate change. What about the mountain itself? What about those glaciers? These are the giant cloaks of ice and snow that you and I see, that you see when you see the mountain from Yakima. That's what you see, right? Are some of those incredible glaciers and permanent snowfields. What about them? More ice and snow here than all the Cascade volcanoes combined. Well, if we take a look at this drawing, this will help us understand in a heartbeat the retreat of the Nisqually Glacier. And those are years that correspond to the approximate location of the terminus of the Nisqually Glacier at that particular year. Let's dig in a little deeper. So for example, I was born in 1954. That would have put the terminus of the Nisqually Glacier about there. So in my lifetime, if I use the scale at the bottom, in my lifetime, the Nisqually Glacier has retreated up valley at least 1 mile. Bigger story, the glacier, Nisqually Glacier, has retreated about 2.5 miles since the mid-1800s, 2.5 miles up valley. And biggest story, all of the mountain's glaciers are at their historic minimums. That's what we call when the glaciers are the furthest up the mountainside since record keeping began over 100 years ago. I'm going to show you a couple of photographs side by side. So here's one that was taken over 100 years ago of the Nisqually Glacier. And I just used the yellow star here so you kind of have a point of reference. In a moment, I'm going to show you another photograph that was taken from the exact same location a little over 100 years later. Are you ready? So from here, notice the extent of the glacial cover, side to side, how broad, coming down toward you, from here to here. Check it out one more time. From here to here. Pretty dramatic, don't you think? I do, yeah. So what do the experts say? Well, Scott Beeson, park geologist, he completed not too long ago a study of the mountain's glaciers, and he found that they had lost 39% of their area, 45% of their volume between 1896 and 2015. In other words, in 120 years, the mountain's glaciers lost over 1/3 of their coverage, their area, and nearly 1/2 of their thickness, their volume. And his colleague, Paul Kennard, he has said that we've lost 8 glaciers at Mount Rainier in my lifetime, 8 glaciers. We also lost the fabled Paradise ice caves. And there may be some people on tonight's call above a certain age who remember these wonders of nature. This was a series of ice caves, ice tunnels at the base of the Paradise Glacier. The last of these disappeared in the early 1990s. So I think just these few images here show pretty conclusively the effects of climate change on Mount Rainier's glaciers, on the snow and ice. And there are some other far-reaching effects that I want to share with you. And for that, let's go to a couple of the mountain's rivers to learn the stories there. So come with me to the Carbon River. So we're in the northwesternmost section of the park here, on a bridge looking down stream of the Carbon River near the park entrance. And I want you to notice right at your feet that triangle of sand. You can see some gravel there. And as you look out, you see cobbles, rocks that get bigger. You look out under the riverbed, you see logs and lots of other rock material. And keep in mind that much of this material has moved down from higher up on the mountain, and much of it is moving onward. It's going to go down the carbon. A lot of this sediment is going to be carried down the carbon into the Puyallup River and eventually deposited into Commencement Bay at the city of Tacoma. So this is a normal ecological process. It's called aggradation. It's where sediment accumulates in riverbeds over time. And through most of the 20th century, records show very gradual accumulation of sediment in Mount Rainier's rivers, about 4 inches per decade. And then Beeson and his colleagues made a startling discovery. Their findings showed that in a 10-year span, all of a sudden, the average amount of aggradation had increased by a factor of 9, 36 inches in Mount Rainier's rivers. Holy cow, that's a lot of change. That's a lot of increase. Why? Well, when you think about the ice and snow in the upper mountain as kind of like the glue that holds together all of these glacial moraines and other rock materials, as that ice and snow breaks up, it's going to allow larger and larger volumes of rock material to move down valley. And when it moves down valley, what does it do? It takes up space. So when you have a high water event, the rivers are more likely to try to widen themselves or to overtop their banks. And the classic example of this was the monster flood in November of 2006, when the park suffered over $20 million worth of damage. It was closed for 6 months while crews scrambled to repair roads, trails, infrastructure. It was a big mess. The park had gotten 18 inches of rain in a 36-hour period, so 1.5 feet of rain in a day and a half. And I think this park employee is probably standing here wondering, where is the Sunshine Point campground? For Pete's sakes, it was here a couple days ago. And so this is part of the park road near the Nisqually entrance that was washed down the Nisqually River. Now, another thing that happens as you continue to lose ice and snow in the upper mountain is that huge volumes of water and ice and rock debris can break loose spontaneously without warning. It's not related to an earthquake or a volcanic event, can just break loose spontaneously and come rushing down these creek valleys and river valleys as what geologists call a debris flow or a glacial outburst flood. And these are happening with an increasing frequency all around the mountain, but particularly at Tahoma Creek. Now, so this is up the West Side Road, if you know where that is. We're in the southwest part of the park. 60 or 70 years ago, Tahoma Creek was a narrow, little, mild-mannered little creek. And because of over 30 debris flows since the 1960s, Tahoma Creek has widened itself. You see all the braided channels here, all the rock material. See those battered trees that have been smashed by boulders coming down? Millions of cubic yards of material have come down Tahoma Creek, emptied itself into the Nisqually. And eventually, a lot of that sediment works its way into Puget Sound. So it's important to note that these geologic hazards resulting from climate change. So we've got increased aggradation rates. We've got higher incidence of flooding and debris flows and glacial outburst floods. All of these things occur in addition to the fact that, of course, Mount Rainier is an active volcano, and it already has its own record of geologic history and geologic hazards. And the primary hazard we see when we look at the geologic history of the mountain is in the form of lahars. Now, a lahar is like a volcanic mudflow. You're familiar with these, I imagine. This comes from an Indonesian word that means like 1,000 stampeding water buffalo. So I hope that gives you a sense for the power and the scope of these events that can come rampaging down Mount Rainier's valleys. Over 60 of them, over 60 lahars in the last 10,000 years. So I've got a video clip. This is a lahar in Indonesia. And frankly, it's kind of a smallish by our standards, but I think it really will bring home the point to you the power that these things possess. If you hear some yelling and hooting and whistling in the background, I think it was probably bystanders who were trying to tell the videographer, you ought to really get out of the way, you're in danger. So check out this clip.
Ada cembolong ah, natas. Sorry, abot tu dekat dia kepo.
So what do you think? Kind of impressive? Yeah, I think so. So this map shows some of the recent paths of Lahars flowing away from Mount Rainier and potential Lahar paths. So this is basically a hazard map. Remember, Lahars flow down the river valleys away from the mountain. And one of the grandparents of all time, one of the biggest Lahars ever recorded anywhere in the world, was the Osceola Mudflow about 5,600 years ago. So I've got a little animation. I want you to watch the northeastern side of the mountain. This guy is going to come tearing down the White River. It's going to wipe out Greenwater and come right across through the Enumclaw Plateau. Here it comes through Enumclaw, went through present-day Auburn and Kent, filled in like 60 square miles of Puget Sound. I mean, we're talking about nearly a cubic mile of Lahar debris. So we're talking masses of snow and ice and rock and water, kind of this slurry of like concrete, wet concrete, this just monster powerful, just blowing its way through across the Enumclaw Plateau all the way into Puget Sound. All right. So in fact, where I'm sitting right now, the window over there to the far right, our home is built on about 50 or 60 feet of the Osceola Mudflow. Are we crazy? Well, you can ask that in the question and answer period, and I'll get to that. In more recent times, the Electron Mudflow came tearing down the Puyallup River Valley. So spot out the kind of the northwestern part of the mountain here. And the Electron Mudflow came down the Puyallup through present-day Ording and ran out into the Puyallup area. And it was considerably smaller in volume than the Osceola, but pretty recent, 500 years ago in geologic time. It's, you know, a finger snap. And that was still powerful enough to float this boulder, which is, believe it or not, in a neighborhood in Ording on the lawn. This baby measures about 14 feet across. So that Lahar, the Electron Mudflow, was powerful enough to float this boulder, the 40 or 50 some miles down from the mountain. Pretty powerful stuff. So as we start to kind of wrap things up here in this talk of, you know, active volcanoes and geologic hazards, you might be thinking to yourself, what's the chances that, you know, something like this could happen to Mount Rainier? Actually, I've got some good news for you. Even though they're first cousins, you know, 50 or 60 or 70 miles apart along the spine of the Cascade Range, Mount St. Helens and Mount Rainier have different geologic and magmatic makeups. Mount St. Helens magma tends itself toward these buildup of these volcanic domes, and then these sudden, violent, explosive lateral blasts, like those of us that remember, you know, 40 years ago. Mount Rainier, on the other hand, is more prone to lava flows that are kind of slow, don't move fast, and these lahars, as I mentioned. So it's probably, Mount Rainier will probably not erupt like this. They're just a little different geologically. So let's take a look at a few questions again to try to land on some of the main ideas, and then I'll wrap it up with a few good news stories, okay? So these are true and false. All of Mount Rainier's glaciers have retreated the furthest up the mountain slopes since record keeping began. Is that true or false? Answer is true. Number two, Mount Rainier's principal geologic hazard is volcanic eruptions with ashfall. True or false? Answer is false. Number three, because they are both stratovolcanoes and close to each other, Mount St. Helens and Mount Rainier have the same geologic hazards. True or false? Answer is false. All right, here's a multiple choice. Number four, blank is the accumulation of sediment in the beds of glacially sourced rivers. Is it A, aggravation, B, scouring, C, debris flows, or D, aggradation? Best answer is D, aggradation. And finally, number five, geologic hazards at Mount Rainier associated with climate change include A, more lahars, debris flows and flooding. B, more debris flows and more melted ice cream. C, more debris flows, glacial outburst floods and flooding. And D, more lahars, volcanic eruptions and debris flows. Okay, best answer, geologic hazards associated with climate change. Best answer is C, more debris flows, glacial outburst floods and flooding. So how did you do on those? I would say just hope you're enjoying yourself and just keep hanging in there. You could be a budding geologist if you got most of them right. And well, definitely a rock star if you got them all correct. So as we start to wrap up the talk and we tie these two big stories together. So this idea of people being attracted to the mountain for thousands of years, over 9,000 years have been going up to Mount Rainier. And now we come to understand that there are geologic hazards there. It can be a dangerous place. What with its record of lahars, some eruptions over the ages, also earthquakes underneath the mountain, and then in the face of climate change, these other hazards. And you think, well, man, people in place, what's going to happen? Well, a couple of things maybe, but sometimes I think of all this as kind of like Mount Rainier, like a giant ice cream cone. Has one of your kids or grandkids ever dropped their ice cream cone on a really hot day and it hits the pavement or the asphalt? It's not pretty. Nobody's happy. It makes a mess. And in some ways, that's kind of what researchers and scientists are responding to. It's kind of like a what's next and what are the questions? And the questions could be very far ranging, and they might include, well, how many glaciers will we lose? What plants and animals will be most affected? What will future generations encounter when they go to visit Tahoma? And I get great solace, I get great feeling when I realize that the connection between Tahoma and its people is as solid and strong today as it's ever been. And on a beautiful summer day up at Paradise, and granted, this past summer, we were doing a lot of social distancing. We were wearing a lot of masks, but still the park is receiving over 2 million visitors per year, which can cause some challenges and problems in its own right, of course. What are people doing up there? 2 million people? Well, they do lots of things. They backpack, bicycle, birdwatch, bivouac, botanize, camp, climb, draw, drive, geocache, hike, stroll, mountaineer, stargaze, photograph, sightsee, paint ski, snowboard, skinny dip. They do lots of things. And they do lots of other things too. For example, in the Puyallup Valley, people regularly prepare for the eventuality of a lahar by participating in regular lahar evacuation drills. These students in the Puyallup School District have about 1 hour to get off of the valley floor, 30 feet up out of harm's way. Up on the mountain, most every year, and not so much this last year, but most every year, hundreds of people contribute thousands of hours in a wide range of volunteer projects. These folks look like they're doing trail work, but I got to tell you, there's tons and tons of other stuff to do. Lots of sciencey stuff, lots of indoor stuff, lots of communicating with park visitors stuff, all sorts for all kinds of people, volunteer work that's available for folks to do at Mount Rainier. Whether you've got half a day or you want to spend most of your retirement doing it, there's opportunities at Mount Rainier National Park for people to feel like stewards of a park, to deepen our relationship, no matter your interest, no matter your age. And I think these are good stories. And here's a couple more good stories as we close things out. The park's archaeological work continues. The person in the background here is the present park archaeologist, Ben Diaz, who is a tribal liaison. So he continues to work with the tribes around Mount Rainier to learn more of their stories and to engage them in the archaeological work at Mount Rainier. This story actually began over 100 years ago. This is the Carbon River Road, just when it was being built. And you know, the engineers just didn't know or didn't care, didn't understand that they were building a road on a floodplain. That was probably a bad idea, and it was probably going to consign the Carbon River Road to an existence of flooding and washouts and erosion. And sure enough, that's what happened. And in the 1930s, crews of the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, worked up on the carbon, trying to build, various rock walls and log walls and dams and different devices to try to keep the river in its riverbed. And even then, back in the 1930s, they were no match for the carbon. And here's some great news. Today, there's a fantastic structure that's being used all throughout the West. They're called engineered log jams. You see that structure to the left there where the big logs are sticking up out of the ground? Well, those logs are buried in the ground probably 20 or 30 feet, so they can withstand an enormous amount of pressure and stress. And that excavator to the right has just finished getting those logs in the ground and then planting that debris in around those uprights. So what happens is when the flow is restored to the creek or the river, that flow is slowed down when it hits the engineered log jams. It causes the river to drop its sediment load. And if you can imagine what that does to the riverbed, it changes the tilt of the riverbed and can actually cause water to flow away from roads or other structures that need to be protected. They're also really great in providing habitat. This is an engineered log jam near Smallwood Park in Eatonville. And these researchers are checking it out because they're interested to know what the extent of providing habitat for migrating salmon is. It's quieter water there. It's a good place for salmon to rest, hide out from predators, and to feed. Now, another project that combines all of these ideas of erosion control and creating good habitat are setback levees. This is an award-winning project called the Calistoga Reach Setback Levee. This is in Ordig, Washington. And you'll see the Puyallup River here to your left, and to the right, notice this huge levee that's set back quite a ways from the river. So when the Puyallup exceeds its banks, it doesn't end up in people's living rooms anymore. It doesn't flood across roads and keep emergency vehicles from making their rounds. What it does is it floods that riparian area between the river and the levee, and fisheries biologists say that's good because that's great habitat for off-channel wintering salmon. Pretty cool. This is a fabulous collaboration between the Washington Department of Corrections and the Evergreen State College, and they've created the Sustainability in Prisons project. They actually provide incarcerated people like these folks here with the opportunity to learn about nature, develop a relationship with nature, and do good work on Mount Rainier's behalf. These plants, native plants, are being raised that will then be planted out at Mount Rainier or in its neighboring watersheds. These folks are raising native violets. In the greenhouse program, they've raised over 2.5 million plants. And they figured out how to raise over 80 species of native plants. And a lot of this is groundbreaking work, get it? Work, because some of these plants, they didn't even know how to raise them in greenhouses prior to this project. Another cool thing that incarcerated folks are doing as part of the sustainability in prisons is they've raised over 18,000 Taylor checker spot larvae and adult butterflies. And you might be familiar with Taylor's checker spot. They're a butterfly of the prairies. At one time they were abundant. Their numbers have just dropped precipitously in the last 25 years. They only occur in like less than a dozen places in Western Washington. They are protected now under the Endangered Species Act, but incarcerated folks are raising them in a facility at one of their correctional facilities. And when I visited, it was so amazing because it seems like the butterflies are doing as much good for the incarcerated people as they are doing for the butterflies. One of the women said to me, you know, it just makes me feel so good working here. She said, it makes me feel like, you know, we're saving their lives and they're helping ours. She looked at me and smiled and said, it makes me feel like the best is yet to come for them and for us. Pretty cool. Last story, you might be familiar with this furry little critter. This is a fisher. Fishers, the bad news about fishers is they have really super warm, lovely pelts. And in the early 20th century, they were hunted to extinction, extirpation, it's called technically, in the Washington forests. They were trapped because there were no trapping regulations at the time, and their pelts brought such a high price. And so what's happened, I think beginning in about 2010, fishers were released at Olympic National Park. You might remember the stories in the news. A large population, healthy population of fishers up in Canada. And so they're live caught, live trapped, transported down, and then they are released now into various places in the Cascades, as well as the Olympics. And this project is cool because kids get involved. And so I like to think of this as a fisher release party. This was at the Longmire campground. And the big people there on their knees are the biologists that are helping the kids get ready to release fishers into the forest at Mount Rainier for the first time in 100 years. There's going to be fishers. So here's the end of the plywood carton is up. You can see the animal starting to poke out. And get ready, because there it goes and goes and goes into its new life in the forest at Mount Rainier. Pretty powerful stuff. Hey, before we get to questions, just have a few quick public service announcements. If you'd like a copy of the book, it's easy to get it in multiple ways. You can get it from my website. I can sign it if you like and send it off to you. Most independent booksellers stock the book, or of course it's available online. And also, I want you to know that I have a couple of other talks that I can give that are book talks from Tahoma. One is a virtual field trip in the Nisqually River watershed. And in that trip, we learn more about the native people, in this case, the original inhabitants of the Nisqually watershed, the Nisqually people, people of the river, people of the grass. And after we learn about them, we begin terminus of the glacier where the river begins, follow it 78 river miles through a whole bunch of amazing Russian products and natural history stories, all the way at Billy Frank Jr., Nisqually National Wildlife Refuge. And the other talk, brand new, I just started giving this last week, is the special birds of Mount Rainier. And I'll begin in kind of a big picture and talk about some of the common species, some of the favorites of Mount Rainier, including this sooty grouse, and end up talking about 3 species of birds at Mount Rainier that are all protected under the Endangered Species Act, and what is the current status and what is the outlook for those birds hold. So if you like stories, if you've enjoyed any of this tonight, I send out a story every month. If you want to subscribe to my blog, I'll send you a new one. And there's no strings attached here. I'm not selling anything. I don't sell your email address to anybody. I just got a backlog of stories. I enjoy doing this. I enjoy writing them, and happy to send you one if you like. So with that, I'm going to stop my screen share, turn it back over to Cy, and looking forward to the question and answer period.